Good evening, everybody. My name is Miles Taylor, and I'm the Director of the Institute of Historical Research here in the University of London, and we'll be delighted to be co-hosting for the third year running with the Pears Institute the Holocaust Memorial Day event. And I think you'll agree we've got a particularly wonderful occasion ahead of us in the next hour or so, listening to John Dobai and following that with commentaries by two really excellent scholars of the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors in Tony Kushner and Bob Moore, about whom I shall say something shortly. It is very cold outside, it's also very cold inside, so please don't feel obliged to take your coats off. There is heat in the building. We're not reliant on that solitary little heater over there, but do bear with us, and I'm sorry that the cold outside is penetrating inside as well. My purpose is simply to be the warm-up for the warm-up, and in a minute I will introduce Ludovine Brock, who is convening this afternoon's panel. Ludovine is an early career fellow at the Pears Institute and at Birkbeck College, and her book is forthcoming, I believe, on French railwaymen during the Vichy regime in the Second World War. Ludovine will be telling you more about our guest speaker this evening. I simply want to introduce you to our two academic commentators. I can't quite remember what order they've agreed to speak in, but I shall introduce first of all Bob Moore, who is Professor of History at the University of Sheffield, and I'm sure will be known to many of you as the author of a recent book, Survivors, Jewish Self-help and Rescue in Nazi-occupied Western Europe, which came out from Oxford University Press 2010. Bob's fellow commentator this afternoon is a former colleague. I think I was his boss or he was my boss, but actually we never really talked much about that kind of thing. Professor Tony Kushner, who is at the University of Southampton, where he is Marcus Seif Professor of the History of Jewish, Non-Jewish Relations, and is the author of many books, edited collections and articles, which have really made not only himself but the Park Centre at Southampton one of the foremost places for the study of Anglo-Jewry and of the Holocaust generally in the UK and internationally. Two of Tony's major works, which I think are of particular importance to tonight's evening, are The Holocaust and the Liberal Imagination from 1994, and more recently, The Holocaust, Critical Historical Perspectives. But those are only just two items in a very long and remarkable list of publications. And it's a great pleasure to see both Bob and Tony here in the University of London doing what they are best at, commentating on such an important set of historical themes. That's quite enough from me. I do think you're going to enjoy the next hour. Let me hand over to the convener, Ludovine Brock. Thank you very much.
Hello, good evening, and thank you all for coming tonight. Despite the weather, I know it's been tough these past few days. This is our third annual, to pick up from kind of where Miles left off, it's our third annual Holocaust Memorial Day event, and which is organised and hosted by the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism and the Institute of Historical Research. And your presence here tonight, I think it really confirms the continuing interest and demand for these yearly lectures, also of their continuing and increasing success. So each year, we explore a different topic, but we place every time, it seems, testimony and memory really at the very heart of our questions and concerns. And this year, of course, is no exception. And I want to start this evening by telling you a little story, which I hope will explain why it is so important to discuss rescue in Holocaust studies and why we are discussing it here tonight. So I'm a history of Vichy France, as Miles pointed out, and I work here at Birkbeck and the Pears Institute, and I specialise in railway workers during the Second World War. And for my PhD, I had to interview a number of cheminots, railway workers, as we say in French. And my first interview actually took place approximately 5 years ago, not 5 days ago, 5 years ago to this day. And the interview was with Robert Lebrun, who was a very friendly ex-cheminot, very happy to recount his experiences during the war, not least his involvement in a really, really massive railway sabotage that took place in northern France in 1943. And the interview lasted for about 2 hours, and at the end of 2 hours, Robert had a gesture, which I will remember forever. And he picked up his resistance medal that he had been awarded after the war. And I was familiar with these medals from my grandparents, etc. They're kind of family heirlooms often. And Robert, he took this medal, which really confirmed his status as a résistant, which is a very high status in France post-war and even nowadays, very prestigious and sought after. And this medal, well, he gave it to me. And he had children, he had grandchildren, and I was very touched and stunned by this gesture of, initially I said, no, you, Robert, you keep it. And he said, no, I insist, take the medal. So I graciously accepted the gift. But then a little later, something else happened, which made me change my interpretation of his gesture. And as we were walking towards the door, Robert Lebrun asked me, but can you help me? I mean, you can help me, can't you? You can help me become a righteous amongst the nations. Now, the backdrop story is that Robert had told me earlier on that in August 1944, he had helped Jean Friedman, who was Jewish, hide after Friedman had escaped successfully, very rare, from a deportation convoy. Now, Robert had recently learned that non-Jews who had saved Jews during the Second World War could be awarded the title of righteous amongst the nations by Yad Vashem in Israel. So, Oskar Schindler is a righteous, I'm sure you know. And for several years now, Robert had been in contact with his local museum, he'd been in contact with Jean Friedman, and he'd been in contact with Yad Vashem, all about how to become a righteous amongst the nations. And he was putting his name forward. And although Friedman confirmed Robert's story, it wasn't Robert just making this up or anything, the problem was that to be a righteous amongst the nations, you have to have been aware at the time that the person you were helping was Jewish. And Robert had not known this at the time. He had not known that Friedman was Jewish. He was just a man in the middle of the woods who needed help. And Robert is very, very frustrated that this detail prevents him from receiving an award he feels he deserves. So here we have, here he was, he had just handed to me his resistance medal. He'd handed it to a complete stranger, and at the same time, he was asking for another medal. And I think the two events, the one where he gives me the resistance medal and the one where he's asking me for his help to become a righteous amongst the nations, are actually quite connected. And over the years, I have thought back on them as a hugely symbolic moment of the end of one era, an era of commemoration of resistance, of heroization of resistors, and the beginning of another one, a commemoration about the Holocaust and a commemoration of those who rescued Jews. So indeed, these small gestures in Robert's interview were very much linked, and they help to show us how the memory of rescue has grown in importance over the past decades. Now, recent events since the start of the academic year confirm the rising popularity and growing importance of the subject of rescue. Last November, Dr. Jean-Marc Dreyfus, a colleague at the University of Manchester, organized a workshop around rescue at the Imperial War Museum there. Equally, the Wiener Library, just a few steps away, is currently running an exhibition on rescuers of the Holocaust and remembering Raoul Wallenberg, he was Swedish. Raoul Wallenberg, he used diplomatic means to save tens of thousands of lives in Hungary in 1944, and John Dobai will tell us more about this later. Now, remembering rescue is hugely important, and it is an extraordinarily rich and nuanced historical topic. It helps us to better understand humanity and human nature in one of the darkest periods of European history. It helps us to better understand the forces that shaped attitudes and behaviors in wartime. But there is also a problem with rescue, and we need to question its fashionable status today. The emergence of heroes underlines a continuous need for the population of today to moralize about this very dark period. And we as historians do not want to reduce the Holocaust to a simple moral story. We want to kind of probe its complicated, its many levels, its complicated points. Ultimately, rescue has become sometimes a distorted element of Holocaust history and memory, and perhaps is our current obsession with rescue in the Holocaust. This is more about contemporary memory politics than it does about what actually happened at the time. So I think today we want to bring these ideas together and look at the history, but also the memory of rescue, and to understand these myths and these memories in their historical context. So Miles introduced Bob Moore and Tony Kushner very well, so I will not repeat what he said, but we'll have Mr. John Dobai speak first. I'm very honored to present him. He will be telling us a very fascinating story, one which involves his rescue by Raoul Wallenberg. His presence here today really reminds us of the importance of witnesses, of oral testimony in history, and of living memory. And these themes are particularly important and appropriate around the time of Holocaust Memorial Day. So I don't want to tell his story at his place. So without further ado, I will give him the floor. Thank you.
We are here today for several reasons. Together, we remember the Holocaust, an event so terrible. It is difficult to comprehend, and the scale of which is truly beyond comprehension. In the Holocaust, the Nazis and their allies were determined to exterminate a people, not for what they did, but because of what they were. To do this, they used industrial mass production methods to kill vast numbers. We are also here to praise the memory of the relatively few who recognized the evil around them and who, unlike so many, did not turn away, saying that this did not concern them. In particular, we praise the memory of Raoul Wallenberg, who was born 100 years ago last year, and who saved the lives of over 20,000 people, including those of my parents and myself. Among the victims I remember is my friend Ivan Borish, who was shot by the Arrow Cross, a neo-Nazi party, when they found that he was circumcised. The two grandfathers who were shot into the Danube in December 1944, and the two aunts and a cousin who were sent to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. We remember the 60 to 90 who were crammed into one goods wagon with my cousin Eva and her mother. The train went to Auschwitz, taking 3 days and 3 nights, without those inside getting any food, water, or access to sanitation. I mourn the Jewish community of Zombor, a small town where my uncle lived, and the Jewish community numbered 1,186, of whom only 201 returned. We all know about the tragedy of the New York World Trade Center on 9/11, when some 2,900 people lost their lives. On the 19th of May, 1944, 3 trains, each containing over 3,000 Hungarian Jews, crossed the northern frontier on their way to Auschwitz, with another 132 trains in those few months. We mourn the 432,000 Hungarian Jews who were murdered, and will always grieve for the 60% of European Jewry who were murdered, numbering over 5.5 million. Neither shall we forget the 500,000 Roma gypsies who were killed, as well as thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses, Freemasons, and people with physical and mental handicaps. I was born in 1934, and my first 7 years were idyllic, surrounded by a loving family with sunny summers and snowy winters. Little did I know of the gathering dark clouds. In 1942, my father was sent to a forced labor camp, and I didn't see him for over 2 years. Strong anti-Semitic laws did not affect my life at that time. The Jewish population did not see them as life-threatening. After all, they had lived in Hungary for centuries, died fighting for Hungarian causes and in Hungarian wars. Their contribution to the Hungarian economy was massive, as it was to the culture of the country. They made considerable efforts to assimilate, many changing their names to do so. When the Hungarian army suffered a heavy defeat on the Eastern Front, the government secretly contacted the Allies in order to exit the war. The Nazis got to know of this, and on the 19th of March, 1944, occupied Hungary. On the same day, a special section of the SS arrived, led by Adolf Eichmann, to carry out the final solution: the extermination of the Jewish population. Within days, severe laws were announced depriving Jews of their culture, livelihood, their savings, their homes, and their self-respect. We were moved into a larger house with a number of others. The house was marked with a large Star of David, and deportations started from across the countryside, not Budapest itself. And when rumors reached Budapest about this, my mother took me into the country and handed me over to a peasant family, so at least my life would be saved. In general, the majority of non-Jewish Hungarians were indifferent to the fate of the Jews. However, a small minority were happy about it all and swiftly took over Jewish houses, flats, shops, factories, and businesses. A minority were sympathetic to the Jews, and they took in Jewish children as their own. After a few weeks with this family, I caught chickenpox, which the peasant woman thought was typhoid fever, and I was as I was returned to my mother. We were marched down from the house we were in into the city, and some 600 of us crammed into a small apartment building. Deportation started from Budapest by rail while the railway lines were working. And then many thousands were driven towards the west on foot. Again, my mother tried to save my life by handing me over to a children's home. A few days after I returned to my mother because I was ill, all the children from the house were murdered. The advancing Red Army reached the Hungarian border. My father's camp was dissolved, and he walked back some 250 kilometers to Budapest. He managed to get documents from the Swedish embassy, giving us their protection and even space in a building the Swedish government bought to shelter those they were protecting. This effort was organized and inspired by Raoul Wallenberg, who came from a distinguished and rich Swedish family. He need not have done this. He was educated in several countries, and he heard about the plight of the Jews while traveling on business. On arrival, he protested, he argued and threatened Nazi and Hungarian officers and officials to save people. He handed out protecting papers even at railway stations as the train of deportations were about to leave. Due to the war, the house we were moved to had no electricity, gas, water, or even glass in the windows, and the temperature was below minus 10 degrees. Budapest was surrounded by the Russians, and the city was bombed and shelled day and night. Although we were close to starvation, we felt safer, even as the Russian army were fighting street by street. The Nazis took many Jews from these protected houses and shot them into the Danube. Liberation for us came on the 13th of January 1945, and the fighting in this city went on for some weeks. Raoul Wallenberg almost at once went to the Soviet headquarters to ask for additional food supplies for the inhabitants of Budapest. On arrival, he was arrested and disappeared into the vast Soviet prisons population. To this day, his fate is unknown. His deeds are remembered all over the world as a righteous Gentile. When the camps were emptied and the survivors arrived back, the full horror became evident. Even my cousin survived Auschwitz, Mauthausen, and Ravensbrück. She returned without her mother. She continued to speak and write about the Holocaust all her life, and I promised her to do the same. Babies, children, parents, brothers, sisters, grandparents were systematically gassed, starved, shot, drowned, and beaten to death, while millions were indifferent at best. No protests were made by universities, churches, or academies. I would now like to read to you a few lines of a poem written by Miklos Rodnoti, who was killed during a forced march from a camp in Bor towards Hungary. His last poem was in a notebook found on his body. In it, the poet foresees his own death. I toppled beside him, his body already taut, tight as a string just before it snaps, shot in the back of his head. This is how you'll end, too. Just lie quietly there, I whispered to myself, patience blossoming from dread. Der springt noch auf, the voice above me jeered. I could only dimly hear. Through the congealing blood, slowly sealing my ear. In conclusion, I'd like to ask you most fervently to hand the torch of remembrance to the generations to come and to encourage everyone to oppose all forms of racial, religious, and color discrimination. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The topic is an extensive one and not one that I could probably cover in 20 minutes, even speaking at speed, which I don't intend to do. What I'd like to do is to focus on the way in which rescue has been written about, and perhaps to suggest some of the ways in which we now have a slightly false picture, to pick up on the idea of myth just for a moment, about exactly the way in which rescue actually worked. And I want to start by picking up a couple of themes that were mentioned earlier on. The whole perception of rescue as being all about the righteous among the nations. Those people honoured by Yad Vashem over the years for their apparently selfless work in rescuing Jews as Jews from Nazi persecution. Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with what Yad Vashem does and the way in which it does it. They have their own terms of reference. The way in which they make their decisions are relatively clear, at least. And they've produced a vast historiography of individual stories, of heroism, of success through unbelievable, sometimes, difficulties. That said, there is a tendency, therefore, to look at individuals. And one of the problems this raises is that we don't see the bigger picture of where those individuals operated and who they operated with. There is only one organisation which has been honoured as an organisation by Yad Vashem, which is the Danish resistance writ large, because they refuse to be looked at separately or individually. Other organisations have taken a slightly similar view of this, saying we refuse to be honoured as individuals, we will only be looked at collectively, and they've been sort of moved to one side. Perhaps the most compelling example of that is an organisation in the Netherlands called the Landorganisatie voor Hulp aan Onderduikers, which is a more general organisation, not specifically there to help Jews, who not only refused to be honoured individually even by the Dutch state, but also their collective history was written in the third person. There are no names in it whatsoever. No actions are attributed to individuals per se. That said, it provides us nonetheless with a huge historiography of individual rescues, but as I say, it does tend to underplay this very important element of the concept of the networks that were built up over time to facilitate the work of rescuing individuals, not always Jews in many cases. When one looks at the antecedents for rescue work, certainly in France, one sees it's having its genesis in the work done to help Spanish Republican refugees in the late 1930s. Sooner or later, the same camps that were set up to house those refugees also housed refugees from Germany, and also the forcible internment of Austrians and German Jews primarily as enemy aliens when the war broke out in September 1939. Out of that came welfare cooperation between Christian, non-Christian, socialist, social democrat, and very many other groups. That cooperation in the French context proved to be extremely important. Those contacts and friendships made at an early stage in the war period, if you like, in 1939-1940, did not have to be forged or reforged when the persecution took on a different form of deportation in 1942. That is, I won't say peculiar to France in a Western European context, but it's more noticeable in France than anywhere else. I've digressed a little bit because the other major form of historiography on rescue takes as its starting point Hannah Arendt and Raoul Hilberg's view of the Jews as going like lambs to the slaughter into the gas chambers. It was a phrase that was used widely in the 1960s, which in a sense denied any possibility of the Jewish populations themselves having any control or any direct influence over their fate. Yet, nothing could be further from the truth. There are plenty of examples of armed Jewish resistance in both Western and perhaps more pertinently in Eastern Europe, some of which we are only beginning to discover now as 25 years after the end of the Soviet Union and the greater access to archival materials in Eastern Europe has allowed scholars to look more carefully at what took place there. Now, that's well outside my area of expertise. But we do have those two parallel strands. Somewhere in the middle is where I want to focus what I want to say this evening, which relates more to the ordinary, the individual, the persecuted Jew on his or her own. They tend to be airbrushed out of this. They are not resistors. They don't take up arms against the Germans. By the same token, they nonetheless do their best to try and avoid or offset the worst of the persecutions. Their knowledge base is extremely limited. How can they possibly know what the next set of German ordinances is going to mean for them? Can they really understand that there is a cumulative process apparently taking place, which slowly but surely identifies them, pauperises them, isolates them, and then finally deports them? We can see the same process taking place in just about every country of occupied Europe, albeit in slightly different formats and in slightly different timescales. Was that foreseeable? Well, some post-war would argue that it was. But for those on the ground with access to very little independent information, and in many cases very little in the way of communal leadership, had to make their own decisions at particular moments that affected them. Those decisions could be affected by any number of factors, and I can't possibly begin to go into these now. One of the features that does appear to make a difference is the degree to which the individual Jew or the local Jewish community is associated with or has contact with the non-Jews in its locality. So, for example, there are parts of Paris, the 11th arrondissement springs to mind, parts of Brussels, which has a big Jewish community, where there was a great deal more interaction between Jews and Christians than in other parts. The counterpart to that in Belgium is very much Antwerp, where the Jewish community is far more isolated from its Christian counterparts. living not very far away. But that ability to interact with Christian or at least non-Jewish communities gives them the possibility of access to help when it is most needed. Friends, neighbours, the transcending of these boundaries, if you will. One can see plenty of examples of that. I've flown this kite in a few places and I still don't know whether it works or not, but the possibility that the very nature of the architecture of the buildings that people lived in, if you think about Parisian apartment blocks, they have a very specific sociology. They look a bit like Brussels apartment blocks. But if you move northwards to Amsterdam, the nature of the housing is very different. And therefore the housing and the way in which the doorways are constructed means that you don't necessarily see your neighbours in quite the same way. Don't ask me to extrapolate this, and I'm not prepared to make any judgments on the back of it. But the idea that architecture may have something to do with the degree of contact between neighbours may have something to recommend it. One of the most difficult things that individual Jewish families had to deal with at particular moments in the Holocaust period, which I'm going to date from 1940 as far as Western Europe is concerned, is the degree to which they thought they could save themselves or at least some members of their family. Really, by 1940, emigration, legal emigration, is more or less ruled out, exclusively, but more or less. The possibility of escape has its moments, but if you think about France or Belgium and the Netherlands, you've got to travel a fair way to find a neutral frontier, and it was well known those neutral frontiers were less than welcoming when it came to people trying to penetrate them and get across onto the other side. Won't talk too much about that now, but what I can talk about is another and perhaps more compelling step that many families were ultimately prepared to make, namely to try and save their children, even though they themselves could not be so, or could not see themselves finding a way to escape or hide. Those of you in the audience, many of you will have children, will know exactly the sort of thought processes that must have gone into those decisions. What do you do in those circumstances? We can hark back to something maybe Tony will talk about in a little while, the Kindertransporter. And the idea that there were parents in Berlin and in Vienna and elsewhere in Nazi-controlled Europe in 1939, prepared to give up their children and send them into an uncertain future in another country, of which they knew very little, if anything. The same patterns, to some extent, can't be replicated in Nazi-occupied Western Europe. But nonetheless, you do find examples of exactly this sort of thing happening. John made reference in his talk to being sent to a peasant family in the country. It struck me when I started to research this that it seemed a bit odd, but then I discovered that in both Belgium and in France, it was quite normal for the Parisian middle classes to send their kids off to the summer to some peasant family out in the countryside, to get them out from under the feet of the parents during the school holidays. It was not then uncommon for those same arrangements come the late summer of 1940, when the Germans had already arrived on the scene, for the parents to think, maybe it's better to leave them there. And there were large numbers of Jewish children who spent the entire war, or the remainder of the occupation, living with these same peasant families in exchange for consideration, going to the local schools, nobody betrayed them, and they just sort of filtered out into the surrounding countryside. It's an interesting sideline on using an existing cultural practice to turn it into a form of escape, at least for the children. More compelling, however, is, and it's more evident in Belgium, and indeed in the Netherlands to some extent, where the persecution was much more intense than it was in France, at least for French Jewry. I'm not for a moment undermining the persecution of non-French Jews inside Vichy France and indeed the occupied zone as well. But if one looks further north, one can see examples of parents looking for ways to place their children in safety, to get them away from the possibilities of being deported. How do they do this? They do it through welfare agencies, surreptitious contacts with paediatricians or nurses who have contacts and who know other people who can feed them information. There are always ways and means of doing this, but it's that moment of handing the child over, not knowing whether you're going to see them again, not understanding, but feeling the danger sufficiently well to make this a necessary step. And in some cases regretting it pitifully afterwards, but usually too late. The other factor I'd place in this context is the whole question of going into hiding oneself. Looking at it as a phenomenon in Western Europe, it's all too easy to take the Anne Frank example of saying, oh, well, if people just hid in attics and cellars and the rest of it. And of course, there are plenty of examples of exactly this happening. But the majority of Western European Jews who went into hiding, and I use the word in inverted commas, did so in very different ways. Hiding in attics or cellars is one thing, but one can hide in the open with false papers. There are all sorts of questions about how Jewish one looks in that context and how often you could be seen out or run the risk of being stopped in the street and having your false papers tested, as it were. But there are innumerable examples of people just disappearing because they're not where they're supposed to be. They vacate the premises where they're registered and they go and live somewhere else. I came across at least one family, they must have been reasonably well off, who went on holiday in the summer of 1940 to a hotel somewhere in the south of France and just stayed on. Husband, wife, 3 kids, spent 4.5 years in a pension in southern France. Never touched, nobody ever came anywhere near them. Extreme, I know, because most people don't have the wherewithal to do that. But going into hiding was a major step, no matter what, because it involved providing for one's upkeep. Now, if you don't have a job anymore, where's the money going to come from? Do you have sufficient resources to fund yourself? If you're talking in 1942, the Germans are winning on all fronts. How long is this going to be? It could be forever. What do you do when the money runs out? All of these factors must have played in the minds of ordinary Jewish families in this period. They make decisions. They have no idea whether they are the right decisions or not. There is no concept of doing the right thing at the right moment because nobody knows. In the end, talking to people who survived in that context, specifically in my own case in the Netherlands, they just throw up their hands and say, it was largely a matter of luck. We all had our stories of narrow escapes. The point is the people who had the narrowest of escapes are the ones who did not survive. I just want to finish this with a small comment, which again comes back to the historiography. It was always assumed in the Netherlands that we knew with some certainty how many people had attempted to go underground in the Netherlands. And the Dutch Jewish community was not considered to have been particularly proactive in this regard. And what happened was they took the figure for the number that they thought had been arrested in hiding, added it to the number of survivors and said, this is approximately the number of people who attempted to try and save themselves. Recently, we've come up with a problem associated with this, namely that the number of arrests was vastly underestimated. And in fact, much larger numbers of people were arrested on the run, as it were, than we previously thought, which of course then inflates the percentage of Jews, even in the Netherlands, who look on the face of it like they were doing something to try and save themselves. They weren't, passive victims. but were directly active in what they're trying to do. And if we can get some way to rebuilding this history in a more balanced format, then we'll have gone a long way to understanding a little bit more about what the Holocaust meant in Western Europe. Thank you very much.
I'm going to continue, as Bob did, in reflective mode of how we approach this wider issue of rescue. Because I think this reflexivity is in itself a sort of form of commemoration and ties into how we confront the Holocaust, not just now, but in the future. In his last and most explicitly unredemptive book, The Drowned and the Saved, Primo Levi warned against presenting the end of the Holocaust with a false optimism and a desire for a happy ending. As he put it, after the disease, health returns. To deliver us from imprisonment, our boys arrived just in time, the liberators waving flags. The reality was far different and far harder. Indeed, the concept of liberation tells us more about the understandable desire to reach for some form of positive outcome than it does about the reality of life for the survivors of the Holocaust at the war's close and thereafter. The concept of rescue, too, reflects an attempt to make the narrative of the Holocaust somehow palatable, rather than the complexity of the position of European Jewry, both during the 30s and in the Second World War. In the years since 1945, in a process that has accelerated in recent decades, the Holocaust has become a morality story, perhaps the morality story of the 20th century. It has the baddies in the form of the perpetrators, defenseless victims, and in the middle, the bystanders. Each category, and the separation between the three, is potentially problematic. After the war, the perpetrators were presented as criminal and sadistic, especially in the form of the SS. That tendency has not gone away, and it distances us from them. The work of Christopher Browning and others on the Holocaust, as well as the example of recent genocides in former Yugoslavia and Rwanda and elsewhere, shows that these genocides are carried out in the main by ordinary men and sometimes ordinary women. And whilst to us today, the Jews, and to a lesser extent others, are clear victims of the Nazi racial state, that was not necessarily how they were viewed by those in the free world in the 1930s and by the Western Allies during the war and immediately afterwards. Perhaps most problematic, because most loose and baggy, is the concept of the bystander. It is perhaps a term that, because it can encompass so much, is used freely but rarely defined or subject to analytical scrutiny. In the context of the Holocaust, if we cannot identify with the bestial perpetrators and increasingly view the victim as sacred and equally beyond reach, then emotionally we invest much in the concept of the bystander. The bystander can be imbued with negative characteristics, literally one who stood by whilst evil triumphed, or even aided, directly or indirectly, the perpetrators. In popular mythology, the Poles have been presented as the worst offenders in this respect. The work of Steve Paulson on the tens of thousands of Poles who helped Jews during the final solution has made little impact at a popular level. The Poles are still presented as anti-Semitic, welcoming and sometimes participating in the murder of their Jewish compatriots. That 3 million non-Jewish Poles were killed in the war, that tens of thousands were involved in helping Jews, and others were involved with denouncing them, and at moments of intense crisis murdering them under their own initiative, shows the slipperiness of the term bystander. Non-Jewish Poles were bystanders, or perhaps better, co-presents in the Holocaust. They could be and were also perpetrators, and 10% of them were victims of the Nazis in the form of murder. But we still crave a redemptive message from the horrors of the Holocaust and search desperately for heroes from the tragedy. The story of Oskar Schindler is now perhaps the most famous, and Spielberg's version, 20 years on, presents us with a figure for whom ambiguity is removed and is ultimately presented as a saint. Closer to home, the process of canonization has occurred with Nicholas Winton, a man who has not sought the honours and recognition that have been given to him in increasing numbers in the last 2 decades. Winton is not being purely modest when he has repeatedly downplayed his role in extending the Kindertransport scheme to Prague. It has reached the level of myth, and is commemorated in Prague now, the railway station, where in 1939 it's been said he never set foot on its platforms. The far naughtier and maverick Trevor Chadwick, who's in some ways closer in characteristic to Oskar Schindler, a bit of a crook, a bit of an alcoholic, a naughty boy, and the equally forgotten Doreen Warrener and Beatrice Wellington did far more in Prague in 1939 and took far greater risks than Winton. This is in no way to denigrate Nicholas Winton, but just to emphasise our need to create a British Schindler, as he's been called. In 2010, in the last moments of New Labour, Gordon Brown presented the first medals to inaugurate Britain's Heroes of the Holocaust. One of these was Nicholas Winton. The other live recipient was Dennis Avey. Avey was a British prisoner of war in the Monowitz complex of Auschwitz. He's an elderly and infirm man. The fact that no one checked that his account of breaking into Auschwitz and changing places with a Jewish inmate is based on an equally problematic testimony from 6 years previous shows how desperate you are for such heroes. And with the desire for such heroes comes the equally strong requirement that they carried out rescue. Bill Rubenstein's deeply problematic polemic, The Myth of Rescue, why the democracies could not have saved more Jews from the Nazis, uses the analogy that the Jews of Europe were prisoners trapped behind Nazi lines. That the reverse could have been true, i.e. that Jews could move around freely and that local populations could help them if they so chose, is equally simplistic. But it remains that during the 1930s, it was mainly immigration controls across the Western world that restricted the movement partly of the Jews of Greater Germany and much more exclusively the Jews of Eastern Europe. During the war, Nazi policy was dynamic, and not until autumn 1941 was the official policy of emigration to solve the Jewish problem abandoned. The huge variation in death toll and percentage of Jews murdered in the occupied countries reflected a variety of factors, mainly Nazi control, but also local initiatives, politics, and so on. In short, the concept of rescue is too limited to understand what was and was not done to help the Jews of Europe. The War Refugee Board was set up in America in January 1944. It claimed by the end of the war that it saved 200,000 Jews, a claim supported by one of the key scholars of American responses to the Holocaust, David Wyman. Bill Rubenstein states that at most it saved 20,000, and possibly, he says, the War Refugee Board actually rescued no Jews at all. I'm not going to argue whether one is right and one is wrong, but just to emphasise that the terminology of saved and rescued cannot cope with the complexity and fluidity of the Jewish experience during the war, or for that matter in the 1930s. Rather than grand gestures of pulling people from ghettos or concentration camps, as in some of the filmic representations, help for the Jews, as with the initiatives of the Swedish government and Raoul Wallenberg, who we heard of before, came often in the form of more pragmatic gestures, money, relief, papers. This then is a somewhat sceptical framework with which we must approach the issue of Anglo-Jewry and the rescue of Jews in the Nazi era, far removed from the killing fields. The area of British Jewish responses to the Holocaust is one of limited controversy, certainly compared to America, where great soul-searching and emotional energy has been spent, with even an institutional inquiry taking place within American Jewish organizations some 40 or 50 years later, starting with the assumption that not enough was done and that failure is the key word. In Britain, both the historiography and the agonising is more limited, although it would not be too difficult to detect a theme of guilt in more recent years, and at one that has been a stimulus perhaps to more open and aggressive activism, which is detectable, for example, from the 1960s onwards in the campaign for Soviet Jewry, and more recently in the support for the State of Israel against alleged attacks from politicians, the media, and in the cultural realm. But in terms of specific research, publications and debates, there is not a substantial literature, and no moment has been particularly reflected on, and there's certainly been no internal commissions. There is a body of work that is celebratory, much of it commissioned by or from within the major umbrella refugee organisation from this time and subsequently, the Central British Fund for Jewish Relief and Rehabilitation. This material is not totally uncritical, but it is often poorly researched. There is alongside it a small pool of scholarly works which Pamela Chatzkis in her Holocaust and Rescue, Impotent or Indifferent, Anglo-Jewry 1938 to 45, which came out in 2002, which she labels revisionist. Chatzkis studies the most sustained from an archive research perspective, and at its best reflects the wise advice of Michael Maris in studying the democracies and the Holocaust. And Maris implores us to explain rather than to condemn or condone. But Chatzkis creates a straw man when she states her book situates itself against such revisionism of recent scholarship. In reality, there is little to unite scholars as diverse as Jeffrey Alderman, Louise London, Richard Bolkover, A.J. Sherman, Bernard Wasserstein, David Cesarani, and myself. Politically, both in Jewish and non-Jewish politics, we cross the left-right divide, and we range from cultural historians to those of high politics. All that unites us is that we are professional scholars, we hope we are, and have been. Our work is based on extensive research in either archives or printed sources. The work produced aims to explain British Jewry in its wider context, and quite rightly, the understanding and analysis of the dynamics and outlook of this minority varies from study to study. Briefly then, how do we understand British Jewish responses during the Nazi era to their persecuted brethren on the continent? The key, I would argue, is to take a longer-term perspective. From readmission onwards, that is from the mid-17th century, the response of the communal elite has been to monitor and police the arrival and behaviour of poor immigrant arrivals. The destitute were encouraged to move on, and relief by the 19th century was on the strict basis that it should help independence, even better if it was away from the shores of Britain. With mass migration at the end of the 19th century, when up to 500,000 East European Jews spent at least 2 years in Britain and over 1 million passed through as transmigrants, bodies such as the Jewish Board of Guardians gave strict scientific Victorian-style relief and retraining and sent on or back 50,000 Jews. Elite British Jewish opposition to the Aliens Act of 1905 was not because they objected in principle of keeping out undesirable immigrants, but the worry that it was the state that was now going to carry this out rather than the Jewish organisations themselves. There were different, more sympathetic voices within British Jewry, especially those of more immigrant origin. But as far as the going to the 1920s, a neglected period in this respect, the power still rested with an elite which was happy to challenge the state to revive the right to claim asylum, supported those immigrants from before 1914 now trying to gain naturalisation, but refused to support a group of 1,000 Ukrainian Jews stranded in Britain because of the United States quota laws. And these Jews remained in Britain stateless for 7 or 8 years before they were moved on. There was no chance of any of them actually being supported to stay. The defence of these Jews and looking after them, these victims of famine, civil war, and huge pogroms, was left to groups marginal to Anglo-Jewry, the Union of Jewish Women, and the Federation of Ukrainian Jews. Indeed, as we remember, the European refugee crisis, and within it the Jewish refugee crisis of the 1920s, was far greater than that in the 1930s. Why then was there so much more of an Anglo-Jewish response in a later decade? Why did, for example, leading philanthropists and financial supporters of the community make the guarantee to the British government in 1933 that they would support any Jewish refugees coming into the country and that there would not be a charge on the state? The crude answer was that there was an affinity with the bourgeois and respectable Jews of Germany that was absent in the case of the Ostjuden, many of whom were in a far more desperate state and subject to violence and discrimination in the 1930s. British aliens policy, it had no formal refugee policy, was to let the right kind of alien in. British Jewry rarely challenged that premise. Indeed, in 1938-39, the Home Office entrusted the selection of those to be allowed entry, strictly on a temporary basis, to the refugee organisations under the umbrella of Bloomsbury House, around the corner from here. Louise London estimates that 80,000 came to Britain from 1933 to 39. One can add that about half of that number came in the last year before war, the time of greatest need and urgency for German, Austrian and Czech Jewry. This includes the 10,000 that came under the Kindertransport. The refugee organisations, by the outbreak of war, were bankrupt. They had initially thought that they would be dealing with 3,000 or 4,000 people and not the 50,000 or 60,000 left in Britain at the start of the war. The government then had to lend these Jewish refugee organisations money, and as one of them quipped, I thought this was meant to be the other way around. I would suggest it is not helpful, in fact the reverse, to say whether British Jewry did enough or did not do enough. It is more important to understand its outlook that what was involved in the selection of refugees. Louise London estimates that 600,000 applied for entry before the war, as opposed to the 80,000 that came in. Selection involved value judgments, not just on need, but on suitability, and especially the ability to assimilate. Hence the putting forward and implementation of the Kindertransport. In the war, the state allowed for no flexibility, and its interests came first. No visas were to be issued, and ones that had been granted were no longer valid. Mass internment in spring 1940 provided the opportunity to get rid of as many of the refugees who were on temporary visas as was possible. Few had the right of permanent settlement. The Jewish elite did not really challenge on either front, either with the admittance of new refugees or the deportation of thousands to Canada and Australia. The elite hardly challenged the government on its policy of helping the Jews of Europe by winning the war, a sort of universalist way of approaching requests to particularly help the Jews. The aim was to win the war at all costs, and only promising post-war retribution for those responsible for mass murder. It's interesting to look at the Schatzky's study, the most intensive study of British Jewry in the Second World War, and the chapters relating to 1942 onwards, where there are essentially narratives of government responses and reactions. There is very little that comes out of initiatives from British Jewry. It was again left to outsiders in the community, such as Victor Galance, on the socialist universalist end, or on the other end of religious orthodoxy, such as Solomon Schonfeld, to come up with radical critiques, most of which were easily deflected by the government. Or, as a third alternative, those working at a transnational Jewish level, such as Sidney Silverman and the World Jewish Congress. It remains that Eleanor Rathbone was the leading force demanding to, as she put it, rescue the perishing, and a body, the National Committee for Rescue from Nazi Terror, received a pittance from the Board of Deputies of British Jews, £1,000. And that contrasts very markedly, even with the disparity of wealth and size, to the War Refugee Board in America, which, as Yehuda Bauer says, was essentially an American government body funded by Jewish organisations. Rescue, as demanded by Rathbone, incorporated all means of helping the Jews of Europe, but that vision was beyond the imagination of most British Jewry during the war. Thank you.